Judge Roberts was humiliating the simple-looking Sarah Wilson in the courtroom, not noticing the slight smile on the woman's face. It was none other than Sarah Wilson, Harvard's brightest law graduate, who had prepared the case file that would end Roberts' career. And the woman knew exactly what she was doing. Courtroom 14 of the New York State Court was more crowded than usual that morning. The heavy wooden doors, mahogany panels, and serious facial expressions reflected the cold and distant appearance of justice. Even at this early hour, the courtroom was filled with law students, lawyers, and curious spectators. Everyone had come to watch the hearing presided over by Judge Richard Roberts, one of the city's toughest judges. Judge Roberts was a man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes. In his 25-year career, he was known for his ruthless decisions and harsh demeanor. In the legal community, he was nicknamed Fixture Roberts. He never compromised on his decisions and was generally condescending toward attorneys. He particularly forced young and inexperienced lawyers to fight in the courtroom like in a gladiator arena. Throughout his career, 80% of his cases had been affirmed on appeal, an impressive rate, but some whispered it was achieved through power and fear rather than true justice. Like every morning, Roberts had come to his chambers an hour before court began, carefully donned his black robe, and examined the case files for the day. As his assistant knocked on the door to remind him of the day's schedule, Roberts had merely grunted, furrowing his brows. "First case is Wilson, right?" he had asked with a strange interest in his voice. "Yes, Your Honor," his assistant had responded. "Wilson v. Greenfield Company." Roberts' lips had curled into a thin smile. Perfect. That morning when Roberts took the bench, he wore his usual serious expression. As he adjusted his black robe, he scanned the courtroom, then glanced at the file in front of him. The courtroom was full. There were even journalists in the back rows, unusual for seemingly unimportant cases. "We will hear the Wilson case," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Are the parties ready?" Sarah Wilson sat alone at the defense table. She was a woman in her mid-30s of medium height with brown hair and a modest appearance. She wore an inexpensive gray suit, her hair was done in a simple bun, and she wore almost no makeup. There were no expensive suit-wearing lawyers or legal assistants beside her, just a case file and a notebook in front of her. Judging by her appearance, Sarah looked like a typical corporate employee, perhaps an accountant or a middle manager. "Yes, Your Honor," said Sarah, standing up with a calm voice. Her voice was soft but confident. On the other side, the state prosecutor's table was filled with assistant prosecutors and legal advisors. Chief Assistant Prosecutor James Parker, a man in his 40s with a perfectly cut suit, stood up confidently. Parker was known in New York legal circles as a rising star, smart, ambitious, and ruthless. Most people predicted he would one day become the state's attorney general. "The state is ready, Your Honor," he said with a slight smile. At the opposite table, Greenfield Company's legal army was lined up. The company's chief attorney, Thomas Reynolds, sat with 3 young lawyers and 2 paralegals. They were all impressive with their perfectly cut suits and confident postures. Reynolds was one of New York's most respected corporate lawyers, a partner at one of Wall Street's best firms and Greenfield Company's longtime representative. Judge Roberts looked long and hard at Sarah. "Ms. Wilson, according to the records, you are representing yourself. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," said Sarah without breaking her posture. Roberts raised his eyebrows. "Do you have any legal education, Miss Wilson?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Some, Your Honor." "Some?" Roberts repeated with clear mockery in his voice. "We're not playing children's games in this courtroom, Ms. Wilson. You have the right to represent yourself, but I need to make sure you understand the seriousness of this case." "I understand, Your Honor," said Sarah still calmly. Roberts pulled the file in front of him. "This case is a wrongful termination lawsuit filed by Miss Wilson against Greenfield Company. The defendant claims the plaintiff was terminated due to inadequate performance, while the plaintiff alleges it was retaliation for exercising her legal rights." Judge Roberts turned to Greenfield Company's lawyers. "The defense has filed a motion to dismiss the case. Let's evaluate this request." Reynolds stood up. With his expensive suit, perfect shave, and confident posture, he had all the appearances of a successful corporate lawyer. "Your Honor," said Reynolds, My client terminated Miss Wilson solely for performance reasons. There was no retaliation, as she claims. Additionally, the plaintiff has not presented any concrete evidence to support her allegations. Reynolds continued after a brief pause. My client, Greenfield Company, is one of the state's most respected employers. It acts responsibly toward the environment and its employees. Ms. Wilson's allegations are unfounded and malicious. We request that this case be dismissed. Roberts nodded and turned to Sarah. Ms. Wilson, what is your response? Sarah stood up, taking out several documents from her bag. Your Honor, I have evidence showing that my termination was directly linked to my refusal to report the company's illegal waste disposal practices. As Sarah continued speaking, everyone in the courtroom listened carefully. I documented Greenfield Company illegally dumping chemical waste into the North River. Just 3 days after I presented this report to senior management, I was terminated due to alleged performance issues. That's quite a serious allegation, Ms. Wilson, said Roberts, with doubt clearly evident in his voice. And unfortunately, you need strong evidence to support your words. Of course, Your Honor, said Sarah. Here are internal correspondences regarding the company's waste disposal policies and minutes from a meeting held 2 days before my termination. Sarah handed the documents to the court clerk. The clerk took the documents and gave them to Judge Roberts. Roberts looked at the documents, a slight surprise appearing on his face. The documents contained emails between Greenfield's top executives clearly discussing illegal waste disposal. How did you obtain these documents, Ms. Wilson? He asked with a suspicious look. Legally, Your Honor. While working at Greenfield Company, these documents were accessible to me as part of the normal workflow, Sarah responded. Reynolds quickly stood up. Your Honor, these documents are internal and confidential. Ms. Wilson has taken them illegally. Reynolds continued, raising his voice. This information constitutes our company's trade secrets, and the plaintiff has stolen them. We request that these documents not be accepted as evidence, and that Ms. Wilson be sued for illegally obtaining company documents. Roberts nodded as if agreeing with Reynolds. Ms. Wilson, taking corporate documents without permission can be a serious crime. This court cannot accept illegally obtained evidence. Sarah's calm expression didn't change. Your Honor, under the Whistleblower Protection Act, employees have the right to access company documents to document illegal activities. Additionally, Section 740 of the New York State Labor Law clearly protects me. Judge Roberts frowned. Ms. Wilson, don't try to make legal references here. I interpret the law in this courtroom. Sarah bowed her head slightly, but there was a determined expression in her eyes. I apologize, Your Honor. However, if I may, I'd like to remind you that in Pickering v. Board of Education, 391 U.S. 563, 1968, the Supreme Court ruled that employees speaking on matters of public concern would enjoy First Amendment protection. Surprised murmurs rose in the courtroom. Judge Roberts' face reddened slightly. He seemed to have paused, surprised. It was unexpected for this simple-looking woman to correctly cite such a specific Supreme Court decision. Ms. Wilson, I'm warning you again, he said, trying to control his voice. This court is not guided by the citations of people with limited legal knowledge. Sarah smiled calmly. I understand, Your Honor. Perhaps a more current example might help. In Garcetti v. Ceballos, 547 U.S. 410, 2006, the Supreme Court determined that public employees speaking outside their official duties still had First Amendment protection. Furthermore, in Lane v. Franks, 573 U.S. 228, 2014, the court expanded this protection and... Enough! Roberts interrupted, banging his gavel on the desk. Ms. Wilson, don't turn this court into a law school classroom. There was now complete silence in the courtroom. Judge Roberts' face now clearly showed an expression of surprise. Chief Assistant Prosecutor Parker sat up curiously, beginning to look more carefully at Sarah Wilson. Reynolds and other corporate lawyers were whispering, taking notes. Ms. Wilson, said Roberts, now with a different tone in his voice, you said your legal education was some. Sarah tilted her head slightly to the side. Yes, that's what I said, Your Honor. Did you attend law school? Roberts asked. Yes, Harvard Law School, Sarah replied calmly. I graduated as the valedictorian of my class. I was also the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review And after graduation, I interned with Justice Elena Kagan, who is now a member of the Supreme Court. Murmurs of surprise rose in the courtroom. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The expression on Judge Roberts' face began to change from surprise to anger. Suddenly, he was confronted with the fact that this simple-looking woman might have a better legal education than he did. "Then why didn't you hire a lawyer, Ms. Wilson?" the judge asked with evident impatience in his voice. "Because I have enough legal knowledge to defend my own case, Your Honor," said Sarah. "I also worked as special legal counsel at the New York State Attorney General's office for a while, and then taught constitutional law at Harvard." Sarah continued without hesitation. "Before that, I served in the environmental crimes section at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. There I worked to prevent companies like Greenfield from violating environmental laws." Now there was a buzz in the courtroom. Silence was restored with Judge Roberts' gavel striking the desk. "Silence," he commanded. "Ms. Wilson, why didn't you inform the court of this information earlier?" Sarah shrugged. "You didn't ask, Your Honor. Also, I prefer to focus on the facts of my case, not my resume." Judge Roberts thought for a moment, then nodded as if he had made a decision. "This court will assess whether Ms. Wilson's termination was retaliatory. However, the waste disposal practices of the defendant Greenfield Company are a separate investigation matter and outside this court's jurisdiction." Sarah stood up again. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these two issues are directly connected. The causal relationship between my reporting my employer's illegal activities and my termination forms the essence of the case." Roberts took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "All right, Ms. Wilson. I suppose you can present your defense?" "Thank you, Your Honor," said Sarah. "However, before proceeding, I'd like to clarify one issue." "What is it?" asked Roberts, furrowing his brows. "Your Honor, I wouldn't normally bring this up, but I have concerns about the court's impartiality." After a brief pause, Sarah continued. "As far as I know, there is a relationship between you and Greenfield Company's CEO, Robert Greenfield. Is that correct?" There was a shocked silence in the courtroom. Judge Roberts' face flushed red, his hands gripping the bench tightly. Reynolds and his team looked at each other in alarm. Parker and the other prosecutors were watching the situation carefully. "That's a very inappropriate allegation, Ms. Wilson," said Roberts, his voice trembling. "Making such unfounded accusations in court is contrary to attorney ethics." "I apologize, Your Honor, but I have photographs of you and Mr. Greenfield attending a golf tournament together last month." Sarah pulled out a photograph from her file. "This was taken at a private golf club in the Hamptons. Here you and Mr. Greenfield are side by side at the tournament's award ceremony." Sarah produced another document. "Additionally, I have court records showing that you presided over all cases filed by or against Greenfield Company in the last 5 years, and that you invariably ruled in favor of Greenfield in each one." Sarah took out photographs and court records from a file and handed them to the clerk. The clerk gave the documents to Judge Roberts. Roberts looked at the documents, his face now showing a mixture of anger and concern. "Ms. Wilson, these—" Roberts couldn't finish his sentence. "Also, Your Honor," Sarah continued, "this morning I submitted a file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding financial relationships between you and Greenfield Company, including evidence of regular payments to your offshore accounts over the last 5 years." Sarah pulled out another document from her file. "This is a breakdown of monthly payments of $25,000 from a Greenfield Company subsidiary to your bank account in the Cayman Islands, totaling $1.5 million. Chaos broke out in the courtroom. Some spectators stood up. Journalists were quickly taking notes. Some were reaching for their phones. Reynolds and the company's other lawyers began speaking anxiously with each other. Parker watched in shock, mouth open. "This is outrageous," Roberts shouted. "I will have you arrested for contempt of court. You must explain where these documents came from." Sarah remained calm. "Your Honor, the documents were obtained legally and are genuine. The bank records were obtained by court order at the request of the federal prosecutor's office. The golf photographs were taken at a public event, and the court records are already public documents." Just then, the doors of the courtroom opened and 3 people entered. 2 looked like FBI agents, and the third was carrying official documents. "Your Honor," said the man carrying the documents, walking forward. "I am federal prosecutor Jonathan Bennett. Judge Richard Roberts, I have the duty to execute an arrest warrant against you on charges of corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice." Roberts' face turned white. This, this is nonsense, he said, his voice trembling. "I am a judge. I can have you imprisoned." Federal Prosecutor Bennett calmly said, "Your Honor, please cooperate. This order was signed by Federal Judge Eleanor Martinez. Resistance will only make your situation worse." Everyone in the courtroom was watching in shock. As the FBI agents approached Judge Roberts, Sarah Wilson slowly rose from her seat. "Mr. Bennett," said Sarah, turning to the federal prosecutor. "Sarah Wilson, I believe we've met." Bennett smiled. "Of course, Professor Wilson. Your classes at Harvard are still legendary. My students at Columbia Law still talk about you." Sarah turned to Judge Roberts, now with a determined expression on her face. "Judge Roberts, perhaps it's time I told you. For the past 2 years, I've been working with the Judicial Integrity Special Task Force of the Department of Justice. I was specially assigned to investigate the corruption network between you and Greenfield." Roberts looked devastated. But you were just a company employee," he said, his voice coming out weakly. "I went undercover," said Sarah. "I really worked at Greenfield, but my purpose there was to document the company's illegal activities and its connections with you. I left my academic career at Harvard and my position in Washington because solving this case was that important." Sarah continued, "For 2 years, I worked as an environmental engineer. Every day, I documented the chemicals the company dumped into the river. Every night, I followed the bribery trails. And finally, I uncovered how you and Greenfield collaborated, how you manipulated the justice system, how you endangered the environment and public health." The FBI agents had reached Roberts and were preparing to handcuff him. Roberts gave Sarah one last look, with a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. "You know, Roberts," said Sarah, lowering her voice, "you should never have underestimated me or made assumptions. The first thing they taught us at Harvard was to always delay our decisions until we learn all the facts." Before Roberts could respond, the FBI agents began escorting him out of the courtroom. The courtroom was in disarray, everyone watching in astonishment. Reynolds and the other Greenfield lawyers hurriedly began gathering their papers. "Reynolds," said Sarah, turning to the lawyer, "tell your client there's an arrest warrant for him too. Your company headquarters is currently being searched by the FBI." Reynolds' face paled. "Miss Wilson, Professor Wilson, this is incredible." Sarah smiled slightly. "Justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, Mr. Reynolds." Sarah Wilson calmly put her papers in her bag. Chief Assistant Prosecutor Parker came to her side. "An impressive show, Professor Wilson," he said with genuine admiration. Sarah smiled slightly. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Parker. The justice system only works when everyone, including judges, follows the law." Parker nodded. "I attended your class at Harvard years ago. I still remember your saying, 'Justice is for everyone or for no one.'" "I think we proved that today," said Sarah, taking her bag. As she was leaving the courtroom, a group of law students surrounded her, admiration in their eyes. "Professor Wilson, this was incredible," said one of them, a young woman. "I want to be like you." Sarah smiled. "The important thing, young people, is this. Never judge by appearances, and always, always fight for justice." As Sarah left the courthouse, Bennett came to her side. "You did a great job, Sarah," he said. "This investigation has concluded with your extraordinary efforts." "Thank you, John," said Sarah. "But our work isn't done yet. Roberts and Greenfield are just the tip of the iceberg. This corruption network is much larger." Bennett nodded. "I know. My team has already begun investigations into other judges. This goes very deep." Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse and looked at the city. "I once believed in the justice system, John. Then I saw how fragile it was. But today, maybe we've strengthened it a bit." A month later, there was a big headline on the front page of the New York Times: "Judicial Corruption Network Dismantled. Professor Sarah Wilson's undercover operation echoes across the state." The article reported that thanks to Sarah Wilson's work, 3 judges and executives from 2 major companies had been arrested. As the investigation expanded, it was revealed that the bribery network had affected many cases across the state. Sarah was sitting in her office at Harvard Law School, reading the newspaper article. She had returned to academic life, but now she not only taught classes but also directed the Center for Judicial Ethics and Transparency, a center she had established after the operation and dedicated to investigating corruption in the justice system. On her desk was a letter from the Department of Justice, an offer to take on the chairmanship of the Federal Justice Reform Committee. Sarah had read the letter over and over. This role was a great opportunity to create systemic change. There was a knock at her office door. "Come in," said Sarah. Lisa Chen, a young FBI agent she knew from the previous investigation, entered through the door. "Professor Wilson, good morning," said Chen, holding a file in her hand. "Agent Chen, it's good to see you," said Sarah with a smile. "Please sit down. You look like you have something for me." Chen sat down and placed the file on the desk. "We've gathered information about another judge, Michael Dawson, Southern District of Florida. We think he has connections with big pharmaceutical companies." Sarah opened the file and quickly glanced at the contents. It looks like a classic example. Cases consistently decided in favor of the same companies. Unexplained money movements in offshore accounts. "We want you to take this case too," said Chen. "No one can be as effective as you, Professor." Sarah took a deep breath. She looked at the Department of Justice letter on her desk, then out the window at the Harvard campus. Students were sitting on the lawn studying for their classes, being trained as the lawyers of the future. "You know, Agent Chen," said Sarah thoughtfully, "when I first came to Harvard, I believed the legal system was perfect. I thought justice would always prevail." Chen nodded. "Most of us start that way." "Then I saw the truth," Sarah continued. "I realized how fragile the system was, how it could be manipulated. But I also learned this: the system only stands as long as we defend it." Sarah took the Department of Justice letter and put it in her pocket. Then she closed the Florida file and handed it back to Chen. "I can't take this," said Sarah. "I'm about to accept the chairmanship of the Federal Justice Reform Committee. From there, I can create more systematic change." Chen looked a bit disappointed. "I understand," Sarah smiled. "But don't worry. I have a perfect lawyer on my team who can take this case. She was in my class last year, the valedictorian. Her name is Maya Rodriguez. On the outside, she may look like just a young lawyer, but believe me, she's a genius." Chen smiled. "I trust you, Professor." Sarah stood up. "I've learned something, Agent Chen. Sometimes the greatest warriors for justice come from the most unexpected places." 2 weeks later, Sarah moved to Washington, D.C. At her first meeting as the chair of the Federal Justice Reform Committee, there were judges, prosecutors, and law professors from all over the country. When Sarah took the podium, a slight murmur rose in the room. Many knew her from the Judge Roberts case. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "today we are gathered here to strengthen our justice system. We all know that justice is only truly justice when there is transparency and accountability." At the back of the meeting room, a young woman was taking notes carefully. Maya Rodriguez, a member of Sarah's new team. Maya, just like Sarah, had a modest appearance, but in her eyes burned the same fire that Sarah had years ago, the fire to fight for justice. As Sarah spoke, her eyes fell on Maya, and she smiled slightly. "Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected people, and sometimes a simple-looking woman can change an entire system." When she finished her speech, everyone in the room stood up and applauded her. Sarah Wilson possessed a power that could never be guessed from her appearance, the power of justice, and perhaps this reminded us of the most important lesson we all need to learn. Never judge a book by its cover, because the most ordinary-looking people may have the most extraordinary stories. Did you enjoy this story? If so, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance and later realized you were wrong? See you in our next video.